It was still quiet in Vietnam when the decision was made. Not quiet like peace, but quiet like a jungle holding its breath. In early 1964, most Americans could not find Vietnam on a map. There were advisors there, yes, men in pressed uniforms carrying clipboards instead of rifles. Helicopters lifted off and landed, but they weren't supposed to be fighting a war. Officially, the United States was only helping. That word mattered. Advisors, assistance, limited involvement. Those were the words used in Washington. In Vietnam, the words felt thinner. In the Mekong Delta, South Vietnamese soldiers moved through rice paddies, with American advisors walking just behind them. The air was heavy with humidity and insects. Gunfire echoed some days, fell silent on others. Villages changed hands quietly. Roads were watched. Trails were memorized. The war was already happening. It just hadn't been named yet. In Washington, D.C., President Lyndon B. Johnson sat at his desk, worrying about something else entirely. 1964 was an election year. Johnson had inherited the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and he carried both ambition and fear in equal measure. He wanted to build the Great Society, civil rights, education, poverty reduction. He did not want a war in Asia consuming his presidency. Vietnam, to him, was a problem to be managed, not escalated, not ignored, contained. Then came August 1964, and the sea. The USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, cut through the dark waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of North Vietnam. It was part of a De Soto patrol, intelligence-gathering missions meant to probe North Vietnamese defenses. Officially, the Maddox was in international waters. North Vietnam did not see it that way. On August 2, 1964, North Vietnamese P-4 torpedo boats approached the destroyer. The Maddox fired warning shots. The boats did not turn away. The exchange escalated quickly. Gunfire, maneuvering, confusion. The Maddox was not sunk. No Americans were killed. But something had happened. And in war, that was often enough. 2 nights later, on August 4th, radar screens lit up again. Reports flooded in from the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. High-speed contacts, incoming torpedoes, evasive maneuvers. Darkness, storms, unclear visibility. It sounded like another attack. It felt like escalation. It was later questioned, then quietly doubted, whether the second attack had happened at all. But in that moment, uncertainty didn't slow decisions. It accelerated them. In Washington, the reports reached President Johnson quickly. He did not hesitate. Within hours, Johnson addressed the nation. His voice was calm, controlled, almost reluctant. He spoke of aggression, of defending freedom, of protecting American forces. He did not speak of war. Yet. Within days, Congress was presented with a document that would change everything. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It was brief, broad, powerful. It authorized the President to take all necessary measures to repel attacks against U.S. forces and prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. No declaration of war. No expiration date. No limits. On August 7, 1964, the resolution passed the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously. In the Senate, only 2 men voted against it: Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Everyone else said yes. Many later claimed they hadn't understood what they were voting for. In that moment, most believed they were preventing a larger war. They were authorizing one. President Johnson signed the resolution quietly. No ceremony, no fanfare. But with that signature, the United States crossed a line it would not see clearly until years later. The President now had the authority to send combat troops to Vietnam. Not advisors, not assistants, soldiers. In Vietnam, nothing changed overnight. That was the dangerous part. There was no announcement to the men already there, no sudden surge of troops, no immediate declaration that history had shifted. The jungle stayed green. The villages stayed quiet. But somewhere, paperwork moved. Orders were drafted. Plans were revised. And a war that had been kept just out of reach was now legally within grasp. The escalation did not arrive with explosions. It arrived with permission. And permission, once given, is hard to take back. Midway through this story, we'll pause to remember why these moments matter, and why forgetting how wars begin makes it easier to repeat them. For now, the country moved on. Campaign speeches continued. Headlines faded. The resolution slipped into the background. But in Vietnam, the waiting ended. The escalation had begun.
By the end of 1964, nothing looks different to most Americans. That was the illusion. There were no victory parades, no mass mobilization, no speeches calling the nation to arms. President Lyndon B. Johnson continued to speak carefully, promising restraint, balance, and peace. "I'm not going to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves," he said during the campaign. Many believed him, even as the machinery of war quietly accelerated. Inside the Pentagon, the tone was different. Briefings grew longer. Maps spread wider across tables. South Vietnam's situation, already fragile, was deteriorating faster than public statements admitted. The government in Saigon was unstable, coups replacing coups, generals turning on one another, loyalty shifting with the wind. American advisers reported the same thing again and again. South Vietnamese forces were losing ground. Villages were falling at night and being reclaimed by day, only to fall again. The Viet Cong moved easily through the countryside, blending into villages, vanishing into jungle and tunnels. The war was not static. It was slipping. In January 1965, Johnson faced a decision he had been delaying. The Tonkin Resolution had given him power, but power demanded use. Each attack on US advisors, each ambush reported from the field, narrowed his options. If he did nothing, South Vietnam might collapse. If he acted openly, he risked a wider war, with China or even the Soviet Union. Johnson hated that choice. He would later say, "Vietnam felt like a bitch of a war." But history does not pause for discomfort. In early February, the Viet Cong struck Pleiku, a US base in the Central Highlands. Mortar fire killed American personnel. Barracks burned. Aircraft were damaged on the ground. This time, the attack was undeniable. Johnson responded. On February 7, 1965, American aircraft struck targets in North Vietnam. The operation was limited, carefully framed. A response, a warning. It was called retaliation. Within weeks, it had a name: Operation Rolling Thunder. The bombing campaign was meant to pressure North Vietnam into negotiations. It was supposed to be gradual, controlled, measured. Instead, it became routine. Bombs fell, then fell again, then kept falling. North Vietnam adapted quickly. Supplies moved at night. Bridges were repaired within hours. Air defenses thickened. The jungle swallowed damage. The bombing did not end the war. It widened it. On the ground in South Vietnam,
American advisors felt the shift before the public did. They noticed more helicopters arriving, more equipment, more men whose orders didn't include the word advisor. Then came the Marines. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 US Marines landed at Da Nang. They came ashore under the cameras, helmets on, rifles slung, smiling briefly as if this were just another exercise. Officially, they were there to defend the airbase. Unofficially, they were the first American combat troops in Vietnam. The line had been crossed. Back home, most Americans still believed this was limited, temporary, controlled. But wars do not respect the word limited. Once soldiers are committed, the logic changes. Protection becomes patrol. Patrol becomes engagement. Engagement becomes escalation. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American troops were in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, there were over 380,000. Each deployment justified the next. Each loss demanded explanation. Each explanation required more force. President Johnson did not announce escalation as a single decision. It happened in increments. A brigade here, an airbase there, another authorization, another quiet signature. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution remained the legal foundation beneath it all. A document passed in days, now shaping years. And in Vietnam, the war finally had a name. Not advising, not assisting. War. In the villages, the consequences were immediate. American troops moved through rice paddies and jungles they did not understand. Firepower replaced familiarity. Search and destroy missions replaced defense. The war grew louder, but clarity did not. Halfway through this story, it's worth stopping for a moment. Not to judge, but to remember. Wars rarely begin with declarations anymore. They begin with incidents, permissions, and votes taken quickly. They begin when fear outruns caution. And they continue long after the moment that made them possible is forgotten. If these stories matter to you, if remembering how wars truly begin feels important, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your engagement helps keep these lessons alive. The escalation was no longer theoretical. American boots were on Vietnamese soil, and there was no clean way back. By 1966, escalation no longer felt like a decision, it felt like a schedule. Troop numbers rose the way tides do, predictable, steady, difficult to stop once they're moving. Every month brought new units, new bases carved into jungle, new runways scraped out of red dirt. What had begun as a limited commitment now required constant maintenance. More men meant more helicopters. More helicopters meant more fuel. More fuel meant more bases. And every base became a target. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson rarely spoke about Vietnam the way he spoke about civil rights or poverty. There were no soaring speeches, no moral crusades. Vietnam was discussed in private rooms, late at night, with tired men pointing at maps. Johnson feared two things equally: losing Vietnam and being remembered as the president who lost it. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution still sat quietly in the background, rarely mentioned, never debated again, but it remained the legal backbone of everything that followed. Congress had given Johnson the authority to wage war without ever saying the word. Now the consequences were unfolding, one deployment at a time. In Vietnam, escalation didn't feel strategic. It felt physical. American soldiers arrived young and uncertain, stepping off planes into heat that crushed the breath from their lungs. Many had never heard of the Gulf of Tonkin. Fewer still understood why they were here. They were told the mission was clear: stop communism, protect South Vietnam, win hearts and minds.
Then they were sent into villages where everyone looked the same, spoke a language they didn't understand, and watched them with unreadable eyes. The war on the ground became one of attrition. General William Westmoreland, commander of US forces in Vietnam, believed victory could be measured in numbers: enemy body counts, weapons captured, territory cleared. If American firepower could kill faster than the enemy could replace, the war would end. That logic required escalation: more troops, more bombing, more operations. The jungle absorbed it all. Villages were searched again and again. Rice paddies were walked until they were nothing but mud. Firepower replaced certainty. When the enemy couldn't be found, villages were cleared anyway. The war expanded not because it succeeded, but because it didn't. Back in the United States, the public still struggled to understand how the country had gotten here. There had been no declaration of war, no national mobilization, just a steady increase in casualties broadcast each night on television. Anchors spoke calmly. Another 200 Americans killed this week. Numbers replaced names. Some in Congress began to question the path, but the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution remained untouched. It was easier to debate troop levels than to admit the original decision had been rushed. Admitting that would mean admitting the war itself had been built on uncertainty. In Vietnam, soldiers felt the weight of escalation without ever seeing its source. They fought in jungles, hills, tunnels, and villages, often unsure whether the ground they cleared would still matter tomorrow. Progress felt temporary. Control felt borrowed. The war did not move forward. It spread outward. By late 1966, escalation had become normal. American troop levels surpassed 400,000. Bombing continued over North Vietnam. Fighting intensified in the south. And the distance between what was promised and what was happening grew harder to ignore. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had been passed in days. Its consequences were unfolding over years. Wars rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, through authorizations, assumptions, and the belief that more force will solve what force has not. By the time the word escalation became common, the decision behind it was already history. And the war had taken on a life of its own. By 1967, escalation had a face. It appeared every night on television. Mud-caked soldiers, helicopters lifting wounded men, villages burning behind lines of barbed wire. The war no longer lived only in briefings and maps. It lived in American living rooms. And people began asking a question no one had asked in 1964. How did we get here? President Lyndon B. felt the pressure closing in. Privately, he complained that Vietnam was eating his presidency alive. Publicly, he insisted the war was being won. His advisors assured him that progress was real. Enemy losses were high, territory was being secured, the end was visible. But the war refused to behave. Every claim of progress required another explanation. Every explanation required more troops. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that brief, almost forgotten vote, still made it all possible. It had never been revisited, never seriously questioned. It simply existed, granting power without demanding accountability. In Vietnam, American soldiers felt the contradiction daily. They took hills they abandoned days later. They patrolled villages that welcomed them by day and resisted them by night. They fought an enemy who decided when and where to fight, and disappeared when the odds turned. Morale became uneven. Some units believed in the mission. Others just believed in getting through their tour alive. Many stopped believing in either. The war was no longer about stopping communism. It was about endurance. In Washington, dissent grew louder. Senators who had voted for the Tonkin Resolution now admitted they hadn't expected this. They had believed the president would use the authority sparingly. They had believed escalation would deter, not expand. They had believed wrong. Then came 1968, and Tet. During the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces struck cities and bases across South Vietnam, places Americans had been told were secure. Fighting erupted in Saigon itself. Even the US Embassy compound was attacked. Militarily, the offensive failed. Psychologically, it shattered the narrative. If the enemy could strike everywhere at once, after years of escalation, then what had escalation achieved? The question echoed across America. Johnson watched public support collapse. He watched trust drain away, not just from the war, but from the decisions that had led to it. The Tonkin Resolution, once a quiet legal tool, now looked like a blank check written in haste. In March 1968, Johnson made a decision of his own. He would not seek re-election. Vietnam had consumed him. Looking back, historians would trace the war's trajectory to many causes: Cold War fears, ideology, misjudgments on all sides. But again and again, they would return to August 1964, to the Gulf of Tonkin, to a moment when uncertainty met urgency, and urgency won. Wars do not always begin with intent. Sometimes they begin with permission. Permission granted too quickly. Permission left unexamined. Permission that outlives the moment that created it. By the time America tried to step back, Vietnam had already been reshaped by years of escalation. The cost, measured in lives, trust, and memory, could not be undone. The resolution that promised flexibility had delivered entrapment. And the war, once unnamed, now defined a generation. What began as a response to a shadowy incident at sea became one of the most consequential conflicts in American history. Not because it was inevitable, but because, in one quiet week of August, it was made possible. By the time the 1960s drew to a close, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had become something few politicians wanted to mention. It was too small for the war it created, too simple for the consequences it unleashed. Yet it remained the legal spine of American involvement, quiet, unchallenged, and devastatingly effective. Inside the halls of Congress, hearings began to ask questions that should have been asked years earlier. What really happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? What intelligence was known, and what was assumed? Why had Congress surrendered its war-making authority so easily? The answers came slowly, unevenly, sometimes reluctantly. Documents revealed doubts about the second attack almost immediately after it was reported. Radar anomalies, confused sonar readings, pilots who saw nothing, messages that contradicted one another. But doubt had not slowed the vote. Fear had accelerated it. For the men fighting in Vietnam, none of this mattered in the moment. They carried rifles, not resolutions. A private in 1967 did not feel the weight of congressional authority. He felt the weight of his pack, the heat, the uncertainty of whether the next village would be quiet or erupt. The Tonkin Resolution lived far away, in offices with air conditioning and polished floors. Its consequences lived in the jungle. By 1969, American casualties had surpassed 30,000 dead. Protests filled streets back home. College campuses burned with anger. Veterans returned to a country unsure how to receive them, celebrated by some, blamed by others, ignored by many. The trust between government and people fractured. And at the center of that fracture was a question that refused to go away. Who decided this? In 1970, Congress finally began to reclaim some of the authority it had given up. The Tonkin Resolution was repealed, quietly, without ceremony. Too late. The war did not end with its repeal. Like escalation itself, consequences lag behind decisions. Years later, lawmakers would point to Vietnam as a warning. About open-ended authorizations, about reacting faster than understanding, about allowing fear to outrun scrutiny. The War Powers Act of 1973 was born from that lesson, a reminder written in law that war should never again begin so casually. But laws remember what people forget. In Vietnam, the war dragged on. Negotiations, bombing pauses, renewed fighting. The escalation authorized in 1964 had taken on momentum no single resolution could stop. By the time American troops withdrew, more than 58,000 Americans were dead. Millions of Vietnamese, soldiers and civilians, had died as well. The cost of that August vote could not be measured cleanly. Looking back, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution stands as a hinge in history. Not because it caused the Vietnam War alone, but because it removed the last restraint. It transformed uncertainty into authority, and authority into action. This story matters not because it belongs to the past, but because moments like it repeat. They arrive as incidents. They arrive as emergencies. They arrive asking for trust and speed. And if history teaches anything, it's this. Wars rarely begin with certainty. They begin with permission.
The Vietnam War did not begin with marching orders or invasion plans. It began with a moment of urgency. A moment when leaders felt they had to act quickly. A moment when doubt was set aside for unity. A moment when permission felt safer than hesitation. That moment was August 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was not written to start a long war. It was written to show resolve, to deter, to project strength in a Cold War world where hesitation was seen as weakness. But strength without limits becomes momentum, and momentum does not ask questions. For President Lyndon B. Johnson, Vietnam became the shadow behind every decision. He had wanted to be remembered for civil rights, education, and lifting millions out of poverty. Instead, history tied his name to a war he never truly wanted, but could not stop once it began. He once told an aide that Vietnam felt like a tiger by the tail. Let go, and it would devour him. Hold on, and it would still destroy him. For Congress, the Tonkin vote became a lesson written in regret. Many lawmakers would later admit they hadn't read the intelligence closely enough, hadn't imagined how broadly the resolution would be used, had trusted the moment instead of questioning it. That trust cost lives. For the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines sent to Vietnam, none of this was abstract. They carried the escalation in their boots, their rifles, and their memories. They fought in jungles, cities, tunnels, and skies far from home, often without knowing the decision that had placed them there was made in a matter of days. They paid for a vote they never cast. And for the Vietnamese people, North and South, the escalation meant years of fire, displacement, and loss. Villages erased, families divided, generations marked. The war did not ask who was ready. It simply arrived. History often teaches us how wars end. Vietnam teaches us something more uncomfortable: how easily they begin. Not with certainty, not with truth fully known, but with fear, urgency, and permission granted too quickly. That is why stories like this matter. Not to assign blame, not to reopen wounds, but to remember that wars are not accidents of fate. They are choices, sometimes made quietly, sometimes made fast, and often made far from the people who will carry the cost. If this story made you pause, if it made you think about how power is given, how decisions are rushed, and how consequences linger, then help keep these lessons alive. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Memory is one of the few safeguards history gives us. Thank you for listening, and may we never forget how easily escalation begins.